Welcome to Sensing the Signal. I'm Terry Patar from Atreides. We're exploring the overlap between data, technology and intelligence in our increasingly volatile and complex world, what this means for national security, and how deeper insight can help organisations make better decisions. I've spent the past 20 years helping organisations improve their intelligence capabilities. I'm fascinated by how we understand the world around us. Now I get to talk to some of the leading voices who I've learned from myself. This time, I caught up with a former colleague, Allison Puccioni, to discuss how the technology behind satellite imagery is changing, not least amid advances in AI, and what it means for human analysts. Allison is an expert in imagery analysis who started her career in the US Army before going on to provide analysis to a range of organisations. Allison is now the founder of Armillary Services, a consultancy providing insight on commercial imaging satellites. Before we get into the discussion, it's worth saying that it was recorded in September 2023. Allison, welcome to the show. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Terry. It's an honor to be here.
Great. I mean, you and I have talked before, we've worked together before. I always really appreciate your thoughts and perspectives on what's going on in the world of not just satellite imagery, but also more broadly intelligence work and how the two relate to each other and what we're seeing in the information landscape and technology and how it's changing. It would be great for our audience, though, just to give them a background to yourself and how did you get into satellite imagery analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I always happy to give you like a hot or a lukewarm take, but I got into this just a little bit by happenstance. I mean, it's no secret. I didn't, do all that well in American high school, so I joined the Army at 17. And I chose the middle option of the three options that they gave me on the little sheet of paper, which was imagery intelligence, right? And at the time, I think this was like September of 1991, right? They gave you the option of being a number of different jobs. I chose imagery intelligence. I started out in the reserves before I even went into training in 1992 and 1993, but I was formerly trained as an imagery analyst at the U.S. Army Intelligence Center and School in Fort Huachuca, Arizona, in honestly winter of 1992 and 1993. So that's kind of how I started. I spent 6 years in the Army, 3 in the reserves, 3 in active duty as an imagery analyst. And believe it or not, I absolutely fell in love with it. So I have been doing imagery intelligence in some form or another. We can say satellites, but a lot of it is aerial reconnaissance. My first job was with the U-2 aircraft in the Army, but I've been doing this for 30 years. Started obviously in the Army, then was in the defense industry for quite some time. I worked a lot with combatant commands and the Navy SEALs for 3 years in the 2000s. And then I kind of got sort of my big break in the open source intelligence community when I started with Janes in January of 2008. And I think for the last 15 plus years or so, I've been doing more or less exclusive sort of journalism or open source intelligence. It's actually the name of open source intelligence is being hotly debated. But here we are 30 years later. I guess some of my greatest hits that kind of make me feel like maybe I'm qualified over or underqualified to form opinions is Army, probably some of the hardest jobs I've done were in Kosovo as a civilian, working for the Joint Analysis Center in the United Kingdom as a targeteer and mission planner. Between 2003 and 2006, I was the senior imagery analyst and mission planner for the Naval Special Warfare, the Navy SEALs Group 1 in Coronado, California. And then I left that to go to grad school. And then after that, Janes, left Janes, ended up working at Google for some time. And then in 2016, I founded a consultancy company called Armillary. And in the interim, I've been working for about the last 10 years on imagery analysis experiments at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation. And I've continued to work with the media, and I've been working for the last several years with the geospatial portfolio at the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. I know all of this is a mouthful, so long story short, 30 years. Yeah, it's been real. I'm ready for retirement very much so it feels kind of fun to be on the back nine of my career.
You talk through that level of experience, and it's like multiple careers in one career, really. I mean, it's
the only thread being imagery analysis. I kind of kept gravitating toward it, and it's hard to do on the outside of the intelligence community. But I feel like I got lucky in a couple of cases, and I just kind of tried to run with it as much as possible.
And that's what I was going to ask you. How much of your career development has sort of followed the flow of how the art of imagery analysis has evolved and developed?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I worked for the very defense companies who built the software to analyze images. And then, I helped design some of the software to help analyze and process imagery for a number of different things, for warfighting, but for also environment and geospatial analysis. And then in terms of the media, I mean, Terry, I think you and I may have come up at Jane's together, but the first question that they asked me at Jane's was, can you put those little sticks and boxes and words on pictures? And I was like, yeah, you mean annotate? Yeah, I can definitely do that. I was called like the chief slide slinger at Naval Special Warfare. So yeah. And so frankly, at Jane's, it was the first time that there was continual imagery, satellite imagery analysis using commercial imagery, of course, in existence, right there. It wasn't the first time it had happened, but it was the first time you actually started seeing continual large-scale media publication of satellite imagery. So I don't know about, I don't think there was any, design to it, to be honest, Terry. It felt like right place, right time, kind of like Forrest Gump gets to play ping pong with President Nixon or something like that. I kind of feel like the Forrest Gump of commercial satellite imagery or aerial reconnaissance analysis.
But I don't necessarily want to... I don't know how much we can compare you to Forrest Gump, but I mean, he was a key protagonist in many of those moments, and I imagine you were too. In the development of this, this area in this field.
I am the Forrest Gump of commercial satellite imagery analysis. Maybe put that on the.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we got the tagline for this episode.
I feel like this is going to stick. I really do. So, but yeah, no, the thing is, I think the one thing that remains is I love the work, right? I kind of fell in love with the craft way back in training, right? I remember just poring over notes. You have to learn what every single piece of military equipment looks like in existence, right? And you have to know that the T-64 Bravo Soviet tank has one extra equipment box that the T-64 Alpha or something, has. And you have to have that language, right, drilled into you and drilled into you. And in military training, especially right after Desert Storm, where lots, like a lot of the friendly fire, there wasn't much, but it all was from faulty imagery intelligence. So it was a lot of pressure. So it was really drilled into you. And the dropout rate and the attrition rate was extreme, right? I remember drill sergeants at our advanced training saying, like, if you break, we're not going to fix you. We're just going to, we're going to kick you out of the Army. So I was like, Louis Gossett or whatever, what's his name? Richard Gere and Officer and a Gentleman. Like, you had nowhere else to go. Clearly my movie references in the very early 90s and late 80s are on point. But yeah, no, I fell in love with the craft, and I feel like imagery analysis, at least military order of battle, is very much a trade craft, like a practice. You have to keep practicing it. You are never quite good enough at it. You always have to do it. So and also, frankly, like another practice, like other practices like medicine, I'm not going to equate what I do with being a doctor at all, but the consequences of faulty imagery analysis in even a policy-making environment, but certainly a combatant command environment is you can jeopardize the safety of not only the people that you're working for, but the people that, for instance, a direct action or strike reconnaissance is against, right? So you have to take it seriously. And for that, I almost feel like it's something that's worthy of like a guild level of expertise. And I've been in love with it for quite some time.
I mean, it's amazing just what you've talked through there. It is queuing up so many questions in my mind. I'm going to try and ask them in some
Yeah.
sort of logical order, so I don't
I'll try to
bombard
answer
you
them.
with a
Yeah.
bunch of random questions. But
I'll get my movie quotes a little like more recent than 1994. How about that?
yeah, that sounds good. But I mean, I'm very fond of those movies anyway, so that's fine. But yeah, I mean, what you've talked about there, obviously the grounding that you had, the expertise you built in the military and working in that sort of space it's a very different, perhaps, training and level of experience than, say, an imagery analyst who's starting out now might acquire. But
Yeah.
you know, is there? I mean, we can maybe bring ourselves forward to the present day almost, in terms of a lot has changed in imagery generally in terms of the profusion of sensors that are available, especially in space, from satellite imagery, with UAVs now, I guess, in terms of aerial imagery as well. How have you seen the sort of changes over the last, I guess, decade and a half, and how do you sort of relate that maybe to to your previous experience, and how is it different now for people who are who are starting out maybe, or early in their career?
Well, I'll start by kind of addressing a mini elephant in the room. You're kind of touching on, and I want to make this very clear. I always talk about my formal training and my experience in the military. And I currently work with most people who don't have formal military or intelligence training or imagery intelligence training in the military. And it would be very easy for me to say, well, I'm better because, I had to rake rocks for 6 months, in Fort Huachuca. But there's so many people who are as good, if not better than me, who are in the open source community, who have never stepped foot on a military base in their life. God bless them, right? I mean, if I didn't have to, I wouldn't necessarily recommend people going into the military to learn imagery intelligence. So I always say, you can learn by doing, right, in the open source community. And some of the best imagery analysts have never ever been a part of the US or UK or standardized EU intelligence community, and they've never been in the military. So I'll quickly say that. And there's absolutely no similarity between what imagery analysis was like even in 2008 when I started with Janes and now, right? In 2008, when I started working with Janes, there were 3 commercial satellites. And I don't want to bore everybody with telling you how commercial satellites work, but I just want to say that you can't park a commercial satellite over someone's house and constantly take pictures. When you have very few high-resolution satellites, that simply means because they're orbiting so quickly and they take so few images that you're lucky if you get one single image a year. So in 2008 at Janes, my before and after pictures were like a Hezbollah training camp in October 2007, and then the same training camp that has a little bit more construction in October 2008. You got a single image over that portion of the Earth in 2 years, right? So you got no imagery. There were 2 working satellites and one that was really wonky. And I thought, if one of the satellites or 2 of the satellites goes offline, then I no longer have a job as an imagery analyst for Janes, right? So there were so few satellites and so few imagery analysts. Today, I just had to give a presentation on the state of the art, and I had to count all the high-resolution commercial satellites in existence. I don't even know how long you want me to start talking about this, but suffice to say there are, I don't have a movie reference, I'm sorry, but suffice to say there are 50-plus high-resolution satellites. Market has really driven the prices down. And I think, interestingly, even if you just want to talk about the regular Google Earthy satellite imagery, like what you see, on Google Earth, it's called optical or electro-optical imagery. There are 50-plus satellites that just sell that. It used to be that just the United States had a couple of satellite companies, but now China is I'm telling you what, we're getting like the Wish.com of satellite imagery over the last, 12 to 18 months. China's got like 6 or 7 or 8 satellites, and they're selling it for cheap. Not just is China getting into the market, but I have to say this delicately. I have been working on an imagery analysis project, all commercial, all open source. And the people that we're looking at keep saying things like, well, this is an American satellite company, so the imagery is adulterated and it's biased. Oh, okay, we'll get a French satellite. Okay, well, this is a French satellite. It's Sparta, it's NATO aligned, so we're not going to look at French imagery. South Korean satellite. No, this is a US aligned country. We're not going to look at this. This is all, fake bullshit kind of stuff. But when you start seeing Chinese satellites and Singaporean satellites, Kazakh satellites, it's getting harder for countries to say this is not what's happening. If a country tries to adulterate or to the metadata of a satellite image to try to make like something that happened didn't happen, you could have done that easily even 2 years ago. But today, if you have 50 satellites from 12 different countries imaging the same thing on a daily basis, it's getting harder to obfuscate what's really happening. So I suppose in a small nutshell, the temporality and the just sheer enormous magnitude of satellite imagery is what is probably top of mind. And Terry, just to let you know, I mean, there is, I don't know, the whole Earth's surface, like a lot of the Earth's surface, hundreds of, like thousands of square kilometers are imaged by high-res satellites each day. And you only have about 40 to 50 people in the open source community who do open source imagery analysis. So I feel like the change is that we used to have 3 satellites that would take 2 pictures a year and a couple of imagery analysts. Now we have a couple of more human imagery analysts, but we have an absolute glut of imagery and nobody is harnessing the information from this imagery at all. Not enough people, at least.
Wow. I mean, that sounds like a really big missed opportunity or something that's yet to be fully exploited. And I mean, just what you described there. Yeah, I mean, just what you described there in terms of the shift we've seen since 2008. And I think what's really interesting is that it's kind of tracked as well with the general shift of the open source information environment, or, the kind of publicly available information that there is, through the sort of the digital era we've gone through with social media, smartphones, they all came about at around the same time. And it's been over that period as well that we've seen this huge growth in commercial satellite imagery, and not just the number of satellites that are up, but you mentioned it there. The resolution that you can go to now is so far superior to what you could do 15 years ago with commercially available imagery, and at so much lower cost. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, agreed. The resolution is better. It's not like worlds better. It went from the best you could do is like 50 centimeter resolution, which is for those of us who aren't orbital scientists, right? It's every pixel on your image represents half a square meter of ground space, right? And you can get what I think is intelligence quality, air quotes, intelligence quality information from about 1 square meter per pixel of ground sample distance or better. But that was largely regulated by US and other countries. They did not want them to be their commercial satellite imagery operators to be able to ever provide higher than 50 centimeter resolution. But now you're getting massive deregulation as more countries enter the market, and you're getting I think 30 centimeters. There are a couple of companies that say they want to sell you 10 centimeters, and that's where we're starting to get like a right to privacy type of situations, because that's, I think 10 to 15 centimeters is 4 pixels per face, and now you have the ability to image somebody, and it's not easy to recognize somebody from 10 centimeter resolution, but if you know what the person looks like and you know their stance, I mean, that's starting to get really interesting. A lot of the questions that I get from folks are like, what are the ethics associated with really, really high electro-optical satellite imagery? And there are, I think the European Union and the German government is considering high-resolution satellite as an infringement upon right to privacy, rather. So yeah, a lot of issues associated with that. But in terms of sheer technology, ethics aside, you have the ability for like $120 to contact folks at Black Sky and not just have images that have already been tasked by other entities, but you can say, I want this satellite to task over this part of this country continuously. And I think my last article I published in Jane's Intelligence Review, I think it was the last issue of Jane's Intelligence Review, we had Black Sky image facility in Iran, I don't even know, like 25 times in a minute. So instead of analyzing a single image, you have to analyze a GIF. And interestingly, or, this is your opinion if it's interesting or not, there was a vehicle in that GIF that if I had just seen a single image, I wouldn't have even known it was a vehicle. It was a white dot. But in the GIF, the white dot backs up, turns around, and then goes over the same place again. That is the behavior of a bulldozer, right? That's English call it, I think, a crawler. And it was grading a road that was coming out of an underground tunnel to a nuclear enrichment centrifuge assembly facility in Iran. And now that you have the dimension of movement, you really have to rethink, how am I even going to analyze imagery anymore? It's not the same as it used to be. And I will as quickly as I can say this, you're no longer looking at, like in the military or even the defense industry, the coolest thing you could do is show somebody like a 75 slide PowerPoint with just images after images after images, right? And I love that. Who doesn't love looking at like an hour and a half of just imagery? But now people, including the American National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, rightly, they're starting to call for what they're calling structured observation management, meaning I don't want to see 75 images. I want to see a graph, right? I want to see what a lapse of time on one single graph, however you have to draw it or, do it, pie chart, line graphs, even like a story map with an underlay of satellite imagery. I need to intuit this information in 5 minutes rather than an hour and a half. And so that's what we're really starting to get into. Human analysis needs to change so that you can distill what I genuinely think was like a month and a half worth of work into a caption for a Jane's article that can be intuited by a reader who is not an imagery analysis expert in 4 minutes or less. So, and that's kind of one of the bigger obstacles that we face. And it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, and that is really fascinating. And I think that also speaks to how, not just decision makers, but the audience or the recipients of that type of intelligence or information, we're everyone's attention starved now. That there's less time. Everyone has less time. Everyone's
absolutely
got to focus on things, and we're all competing for attention of decision makers and people who you want to communicate to. And I think that's a really interesting aspect, not just of what you described for imagery analysts, but also for anyone who wants to communicate their findings in a way that is easily and quickly absorbed by the audience. And actually those skills are becoming much more important, I think, across the board for intelligence work. It's something that perhaps in the past people didn't have to factor in as much time for. When you're putting together a report or putting together a slide deck and you get very good and you're well practiced at doing that, it can be done fairly quickly. Whereas now actually it takes that bit longer and a bit more time to figure out how to create a more dynamic output that you can show somebody. And so just what you're talking about there in terms of employing GIFs or using story maps or other types of dynamic visual and perhaps even more interactive ways of engaging with some of those elements of content, that's, I think, I can see why it would affect imagery analysis even more so than other types of intelligence.
Yeah, no, I think we already had, as imagery analysts in the open source community, we had ourselves a bit of a head start. I can't cite the exact thing, but I think Jane's had a couple of articles, one that had no satellite imagery and one that was not very consequential, but it did have a satellite image, and it got orders of magnitude more internet clicks, right, on its online link. So satellite imagery, I learned at Jane's that people don't like to read as much as they like to look at pictures. That is a fundamental truth. People will definitely tuck a magazine under their arm, but when it comes to really looking at something, a satellite image, I think, increases and amplifies the exposure of any journalistic article. So we already had that heads up, but even now, and you're absolutely right, attention these days is absolute currency. And forget about just attention. I mean, there's trust issues with the media. So satellite imagery is just as much reviled as it is loved in the open source community. And it's difficult to help people understand that this is not spycraft. This is a data set that can be interpolated or interpreted in a meaningful way that can educate people, right? And I think a lot of people have these issues about right to knowledge and right to the press. I think satellite imagery really should be considered as a very meaningful aspect of data when you're trying to find things like nuclear weapons and things that can ruin anybody's day. I think people have the public right to know. So satellite imagery, I think, is a good component of that. And to your point, Terry, it's incredibly important to publish something that's engaging and frankly even eye-catching, as long as it's in a responsible way, to show people what's happening. I can actually go in a couple of different directions with this discussion, because there are also problems with satellite imagery. It often fits a narrative that the media already has about a nation. For instance, when we try to publish images of a new orphanage that's being built in the DPRK, nobody is going to publish that. But if there's a new submarine, or if they're, submarine base, that's going to be front page news everywhere. So, there are a lot of aspects to think about it. But at the end of the day, it's really important to tell your story in a way that you can get people to care about what you're talking about. And if you could figure that out, let me know, because it's been a lifetime journey.
Well, I think you've touched on a few really important points there. And one, obviously, is that element of natural bias and people seeking out evidence to prove what they want to show, or only presenting the evidence that helps tell the story they want to tell, and maybe we don't, as the audience, necessarily know what's been left out and what they haven't shown us in terms of whether other images that might, from the day before or the day after, that might tell a different story, or we're relying on the outlets, and especially now that we are, and second point, now that we are being exposed much more to satellite imagery or other types of imagery analysis, and it is part of media, it is part of the news. Outlets like the New York Times and others have their sort of visual storytelling teams and their visual investigation teams, and they may call upon imagery analysts to help them explain what's going on in a place. There is a real tension, I guess, in terms of, okay, that's really useful and it can be incredibly revealing, but we've got to maintain trust as well, and we've got to understand how do we verify that. And I guess for the audience, it's about educating them perhaps more about, okay, well, where else could you go to look for, other sources that might give you either a different perspective or also confirm, actually, this image has been well analyzed, and we understand what's going on in this place, and this is accurate.
Indeed. And I think you're seeing maybe a latency between the time that satellite imagery is being published, or the 5 years or 10 years between the time satellite imagery is being published, and truly when there are going to be enough institutions that would account for maybe journalistic and academic pluralism, right? I mean, you have you don't currently have a number of different organizations always doing the same type of satellite journalism. You do in a number of cases, and increasingly so. And that's, I think, extremely important in correcting for bias and kind of educating or providing information so that the public can have a number of different sources to look at. You've seen that you see a number of different organizations look at like nuclear proliferation in North Korea. That's a really common occurrence that you see, and you will see people who simply get it wrong. They're saying like, oh, this tunnel leads to a nuclear enrichment facility. I'm like, how do you know that, right? And you'll see a number of people calling other people out and saying, okay, this is unbiased information. And you come into some problems when you can say pretty much anything you want on satellite imagery, and there's not enough public literacy to kind of question that. And yet the satellite amplifies the exposure of your work so much that you could get notoriety without being right. And that, I think we're starting to see a good amount of backlash against that a little bit. So I think that's a positive thing. I think that people must be held accountable to the quality of their work, much like in the rest of journalism. And we're also, as you know, I mean, journalism today looks a lot like it did 50, 25 years ago, even 10 years ago. So how do you kind of cut through the noise? How do you distinguish signal from the noise? And ultimately, I do think more and more institutions each year. I'm talking about universities, media organizations. They are incorporating satellite imagery into their research. So, and imagery is becoming cheaper and cheaper. My parallel would be in the 70s and 80s, the US and the European Space Agency launched a bunch of environmental satellites that collect very crude environmental data like precipitation levels and stuff like that. And they just started collecting that on a near daily basis from space for decades and decades and decades. And over the late 70s to today, you actually see the emergence of a field called geospatial information sciences. So the GIS field is largely associated with these environmental satellites. And I do think much in the same way that we're starting to get high resolution commercial satellites out there, you are going to see more institutions start looking at imagery intelligence as a kind of a component of academic curricula. You're starting to see a couple of universities now teach workshops and a little bit of coursework on imagery analysis where that just simply didn't exist a year, like 2 years ago or even 3 years ago. So I think the more educated people are, the more you're going to see practitioners. And I think it'll just, lift all boats, as they say. I think it'll make the landscape quite a bit better for commercial satellite imagery analysis in the open source community.
That's really interesting because, it will hopefully give us more people who are working with those skills and developing those skills and able to put out into the public domain analysis of imagery that is stuff that others can either verify, corroborate, etc. But it just gives us more people involved in that conversation because something you kind of alluded to earlier, and you sort of mentioned that now there's obviously this huge growth in imagery as we've talked about, and the cost has come down. There seems to be a lot more imagery and analysis enthusiasts. I don't know if there's a better way to put it. But,
I've called them hobbyists or enthusiasts.
Hobbyists, But people who might in some ways put out some really interesting stuff. But my worry is sometimes that will go out onto, say, social media. Journalists use a lot of social media as a primary source. They'll pick that up and run with it without really necessarily having the skills or the expertise or knowing who else to go to verify it or check it.
Yeah.
And so maybe if there was more of that profusion of the skills and the expertise needed to really give us that community of people who can do that more often, hopefully we'll see less or fewer examples of analysis which is subsequently shown to be incorrect or misleading, etc.
Yeah, no, I mean, that just doesn't have the likelihood of happening. That absolutely happens, right? People can, enthusiasts, and by the way, again, every part of me wants to hate all enthusiasts who just sit and look at Google Earth and like say stuff. But there are many very talented people who just really enjoy looking at satellite imagery, and you can get good at it. A way to get good at imagery analysis is to look at a ton of imagery all the time. And you can ask yourself, what the hell is this? And Google stuff and look for different interesting artifacts. And so there is a lot of decent quality in hobbyists or enthusiasts who do tweet things. And then there are people who get a lot of notoriety, but there are some very noteworthy exceptions to the quality, right? There are a number of things I can think of that were just flat out wrong or misguided, and they do get a lot of notoriety for it. So you are correct. I couldn't say it any better. I think, there are a number of organizations like the Stanley Center that are very interested in kind of unpacking how do you engage the media to increase literacy in imagery analysis so that they can be better stewards of the data for the public that they serve, right? There are a number of organizations that are really interested in that kind of thing. And I am completely for it. I'm trying to kind of retire from just sort of day-to-day working, but I am still really passionate about the field as a whole. And I think you are spot on to say that if we can't at least try to serve the public, if we can't publish imagery that isn't so well annotated that the viewer or the reader doesn't figure out how to intuit the imagery for themselves, then what are we even doing? And it's a very long road. But with the significant increases in the amount of imagery and the interest. I think that's something that we should put as, top of the list of the things that need to be done for us to be responsible imagery analysts in the open source community.
Yeah, and do you find that a lot of the enthusiast or hobbyist imagery analysis is also driven by or suddenly spikes when you have a situation like we're seeing in Ukraine, since the Russians invaded? Any kind of conflict really, but a major conflict especially, is going to draw out suddenly a lot of people poring over imagery who maybe don't have the expertise to analyze it. And is it then harder for someone like yourself or other people with genuine expertise to kind of be heard above the noise, to say, actually, wait, this is what's going on here, and this is not accurate, or this is accurate? And do you find yourself, I don't know whether you get calls from media outlets say, asking you to look at imagery and say, is this accurate or not? But it strikes me now that there are so many opportunities for people to put out stuff, and it might not be by accident. We might see, especially in a conflict where you've got two sides trying to control the narrative of what's going on. We're in a world that's afflicted by disinformation, etc., and just general confusion around what people will believe and trust. And you mentioned that before in terms of the sources, but I know. Do you see that? What effect do you think that the current conflict has had, if any, in terms of that trend? Has it accelerated things even further, or were we heading down that path already?
I think the Ukraine conflict, the disclosure of American assets of the Ukraine conflict, and the public interest and the deluge of disclosed commercial satellite imagery has actually been good for the field. And it's been an interesting element to the entire war and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Just for context, I looked at, from imagery, a lot of what happened in Syria, right, at the hands of the Bashar al-Assad and the Russian military. And there were it was a really, really deadly conflict. And there was a lot of news coverage over it, a ton of it, but not enough. I mean, the city of Aleppo at one point, I think it was 2016, 2017. I'm killing myself to try to remember this. But the city of Aleppo, I think it was a population of 1.8 million people. That city, by the time that the forces were done with it, it was like 45,000 people. There is a huge refugee emigration in Syria. So I was, you're kind of sitting there looking at this by yourself. You're not seeing it on the news, certainly in the United States, I'm sure a little bit more maybe in Europe. But when it came to Ukraine, frankly, I thought the attention was fantastic. I was really happy that there were people. And honestly, there was so much social media pouring over news outlets, satellite imagery, Twitter, TikTok, like a ton of TikTok videos. I worked with a couple of students at Stanford who would triangulate TikTok videos to satellite imagery so that they can get a better record of the scale and the scope and the pace and the event of the activity. That I think that the amount of satellite imagery and the amount of attention to Ukraine was a good thing. I don't feel like there was that fog of war deluge where everybody was wrong about everything. There certainly was a lot of that. But I think maybe I'm overly optimistic. I think in a lot of cases, some of the good information was echoed in such a way by responsible news media outlets that I thought we got a pretty exhaustive and comprehensive view of like the first, the first on TV ground invasion, Russian ground war in Ukraine. So I don't think it was a bad thing at all. In short, Terry, I think it was a really good thing. I think that there was a lot of eyes on that event, and there were a lot of new types of intelligence that were honed and performed in the open source community. And I thought there was a lot of media coverage for a lot of good work. So I hear what you're saying, like in the fog of war and everybody has access to information, it can be a complete disaster. Even in the intelligence communities, when you, like in post-September 11th, when I was working as a subcontractor for a three-letter agency. Everybody was just running around, different skiffs around the country trying to do stuff. I mean, it was a positive experience, but it is difficult to get quality information, even to the right people during this. But I feel like it's more information is better than less information. And you saw a lot more information, for instance, during Ukraine than you did during the Syrian war.
That's really interesting. And I think especially with that potentially bringing together so many of the things that you've just talked about there, different sources of information, whether it's news, whether it's social media, people uploading videos from being in country and on the ground, and that combination of those coming together with commercial satellite imagery, and therefore people being able to publish and talk openly in the public domain about what's going on, and that profusion coming together. It seems like that could be it could go one way or another, but it sounds like so far what we've seen in that war is that that's been really a net positive for everybody who's observing and trying to understand what's happening. And maybe trying to make decisions based on what they understand about what's happening. And maybe that will be the way forward. Maybe we'll see more of that. Do you think that's sort of the trend that we'll see if there's ever a similar situation or another conflict arises somewhere else?
Well, I believe that media follows public demand. And I believe the public demand, for one, good or for bad, for whatever reason, for the invasion of Ukraine was extraordinary. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. So it was an absolute windfall, a gold rush of not just conventional information like commercial satellite imagery, right? But you had people in the US changing their VPN to be local to Ukraine and going on like Russian Hinge or whatever, like Russian dating sites, pretending to be local women asking Russian troops where their location was, right? So you have like locational data based off a Hinge app plus TikTok plus all sorts of things. It's just so much information that you can actually use to synthesize a really interesting common operational picture that like a military commander would dream of. So I'm agog at the amounts of information that you could use to triangulate, God knows, with satellite imagery. But even if you had 4 or 5 different instances of independent social media posts over the same type of event, that's intelligence quality information. So I don't know. I mean, in one way, you're kind of asking me what makes people interested in war, right? And then what makes people tired of war? And I think, if you forgive my crassness, I think that it takes a smart person to be able to look at satellite imagery and say what's on the picture. And I think it takes a genius to get somebody to give a shit about it. And I consider myself, after 30 years, a smart person, but I do not know what it takes to get people to care. I really don't.
Wow. Yeah.
I've been fortunate enough there. I've last year I went to a conference where Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Ressa was speaking, and she talked about the attention being absolute currency, and we are sort of in a world where media is being adulterated and fixed to get us to kind of think a certain way and do something. And I hope, Terry, I'm not sure, but I hope that things like commercial satellite imagery, right? It is a pretty strict data set. It's kind of binary if something's there or something isn't there. It could be interpreted to mislead people, but it's like somebody said this way more elegantly, but you can fool some people sometime, but you can't fool all the people all the time. Satellite imagery is an instance of where you can screw it up a couple times. But if you have 50 satellites taking the same image of the same thing on the same day, you can't screw it up that bad forever. So it's a pretty solid stalwart of what I consider to be the future of journalism. I think it would be a really trustworthy source. You just need more literacy.
That's really interesting. So I've got a couple of questions in mind before I come. I'm going to bring you back to that point about how do we get that attention, and how do you maybe cross over into being a genius and commanding eyeballs onto this stuff. But I mean, I guess the first question I have in mind is, you mentioned obviously so many different types of information that can be generated from a particular situation, and especially in a conflict like in Ukraine. But even elsewhere nowadays, we've got so many other ways of understanding what's going on. for an imagery analyst, how does that process of how has it changed the process of tipping and queuing to determine, okay, what's a location of interest and what are we looking for there? Has it become a more challenging environment because you're having to maybe get your queue from information which in itself may be even harder to verify in some ways, but also just that deluge and that flood of information from certain areas that maybe are pointing you towards, okay, where do I need to analyze? And then at the same time, you've got a profusion of available imagery potentially to look at. How do you as an analyst maybe manage that process?
Yeah, no, I just talked about it this morning. There are certain things that you can get one single satellite image and you could be like, bam, this is it. Just like anything, like if there's a submarine dock in the UK and all you need is a single satellite image of that submarine in its dock, and you're like, hey, there's a submarine at the dock. And it's going to be the biggest selling article because people love to look at pictures of submarines. But then I was talking about this morning, you talk about like large scale, low intensity conflict. And in 2017, I was commissioned to track Boko Haram over 60,000 square kilometers of, northeastern Nigeria. And when I'm talking about that submarine, it's 100% just imagery analysis. When I'm talking about tracking Boko Haram, which is a non-state actor whose footprint involves light utility vehicles and motorcycles and nothing else you could see on satellites, you need to do about 95% open source research and then 10% satellite imagery. And then the satellite imagery doesn't become the driver, it becomes the sort of corroborating tool, right? If I have 80 tweets that say, oh, Konduga, the town, is under siege on this date in February in 2014, and this is what's happening. You're there basically, in this particular city in Konduga, something like, almost 1,000 people were massacred. It was not an uncommon occurrence for this region in Nigeria during this time frame. But the satellite image showed the signatures of a siege that I almost wouldn't have known. It's almost like a Rosetta Stone. You need to have the image taken of the date of all of the media. You need to have, in this case, I used Nigerian Air Force footage, where they would actually publish the drone footage on YouTube, and that you could see the coordinates at the side. So you used a ton of information, like just a ton of information, and then it makes your imagery analysis possible. I'm not going to say easy, but possible. And then what it looks like on imagery might be very different than what it looks like on camera. But again, a lot of people might ask, why even have a satellite when you have 60 social media photos? Because satellite imagery can tell you what you might not easily ascertain about the scale and the pace and the scope of the activity from one single ground picture. So it's a complement to the open source information. It isn't the thing itself. Does that kind of address your question?
Yeah, definitely. So it's just amazing for you to talk through that case study of and bringing together those different types of information. Like you're saying, especially in a low intensity conflict where the subjects you're trying to identify will potentially blend in fairly well with the local population when they choose to, etc. And so that's
there was a city
example.
There's a city that was, I tell you what, I ruined my eyesight and probably my mental health just trying to do this. But Boko Haram, there was a city called Damask where the Boko Haram's MO back in the 2015, 2016 era was to just go into a town, burn down the market square and sometimes the mosque, and then siege the town, right? People couldn't get out. And they would kill everybody, right? I mean, we probably should have a discussion about how long-term imagery and open source intelligence might have something that Bellingcat calls vicarious trauma. I call that witness-related trauma. But before that, I mean, you literally, after reading the news and looking at the imagery, you can see like mass graves. In fact, that's actually kind of what my specialty was in the 90s in the Balkans, unfortunately. But you can see mass graves throughout the city of Damascus. You'd see where they burned down, the local municipal buildings, and they just sort of took over the town. And you have to document that because you can use these visual signatures, scorched earth, adulterated roads, light utility vehicles, a couple of things, and then just tons of imagery later, you can find those signatures to find new instances of, for instance, low intensity conflict that is happening in other towns in the region. So yeah, it is possible to analyze low intensity conflict. It is the hardest thing to do from satellite imagery, but it's often not the worst way to do it because you can't get access to certain regions in Nigeria at that time. You could not get access to Aleppo in Syria. So you'd have to watch it with a satellite, but I wouldn't say that commercial satellite imagery was giving you all of the information, but it was an important component of an overall open source intelligence picture.
Yeah, and it kind of brings me on to maybe my next question. And I just want to touch briefly on that point you made about vicarious trauma, because that is really important, and I think it's one that's being recognized a lot more amongst open source intelligence organizations or people involved in whatever it may be called, but is essentially looking at material which is in the public domain or from commercial information sources that might be especially shocking or visually impactful in a really harmful way. And I think hopefully there's more resources going towards that, and people are helping people working on that kind of material more often than perhaps has happened in the last 15 to 20 years. But I wanted to maybe bring you on to talking about the impact of new developments in technology and what we're seeing perhaps with automation and AI. And are you seeing any kind of things that are helping that kind of process that an analyst would go through, from, say, getting on top of the information that helps tip and cue to then, and can that process then be automated into tasking or capturing satellite imagery? And then beyond that, is there any kind of useful automations that you're seeing, or your useful use of newer technology and whether it's AI, etc., or machine learning, being applied to doing the imagery analysis, not in its entirety, I would imagine, but helping analysts either do change detection or identifying specific types of entities and objects?
Yeah, absolutely. I will quickly start by saying that when somebody says like, "Hey, let's just use AI to do it," it kind of, it's not. I wish. I think I've said earlier today to another person that the first time somebody said that imagery will be automatically analyzed and the human imagery analyst will be out of the picture was in 1993, and I'm still here. I'm trying to retire. I'm waiting for the machines to take over, and I don't think it's happened to quite an extent.
It sounds like you're really willing them on.
I know, I'm goading them.
Yeah,
take my job. But no, So yes, of course, there has been excellent change detection algorithms, machine learning detection algorithms. I work with a couple of companies. I've worked with Black Sky, the satellite company that has an in-house automated detector and a classifier for aircraft, right? And that isn't necessarily new. There's a company in Europe called Preligens that does detection and classification of aircraft so that you never have to count fighters on a jet, runway again. It will count them for you, and you don't get the 60 slide presentation like I love to show people. You're going to get a graph that shows you the fluctuations of aircraft on that base. The interesting thing about Black Sky is that they can do the same thing on lower resolution imagery, and you can do this with aircraft because most aircraft are, tens of meters. And you do that on 1 meter resolution. But because Black Sky has, I think it's 14 satellites now, I did a project where you looked at 7 different air bases, taken 1 or 2 images a day for 30 days. So you're looking at 400 images or so, a little over that, of 7 different bases. And I don't want to look at every aircraft on every military base, but you can get a line graph of all 7 bases, and you can track fighters or cargo or AWACS or all sorts of different aircraft. And you can see base fluctuations, like are they conducting a sortie, and is one fighter going from one base to another base? You can see a diminishment of fighters at one base on your line graph, right, while you see an increase of fighters at the other base. So you can see sort of the inter-base analysis. And that's just simply people are starting to do that a lot with military order of battle, right? You can do that with ships. You can more or less do that with tanks. You can do that. And you've been able to do that for a long time. Worked with a couple of folks a few years ago at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, and they're doing a lot of incredible things with AI. I think they started this campaign to do automated detection and predictive analysis of things like incendiary explosive devices, which are really, really difficult to find with overhead imagery, really difficult. And they don't look the same. They're not uniform. So when it comes to counting a car or a tank or something like that, you really do see, I wouldn't necessarily even call it AI, but it's sort of like machine learning or computer vision to do automated detection of cars. And again, Terry, I think the kind of secret sauce here is when you get so many satellites, you can start to look at very, very, very broad patterns of life on Earth. Everything from fluctuations at a military base on a day-to-day basis. An amazing geospatial analyst friend of mine at Stanford, she was able to predict the time of day that a Chinese directed energy weapons facility would open the roof to like shoot a beam into the air just based on analysis of 200 images.
That's incredible.
And we're not just trying to do this ourselves. We're trying to train a machine to do that so they can take 600 images over at a month and tell us very nuanced pieces of information. So I guess in short, I'm trying to say that the combination of ultra high cadence, high resolution imagery with automated detection is really interesting to me. And I hope that happens. I'll quickly also say that there's BlackSky calls this functional site decomposition, which is where, and I've kind of helped kind of come up with this concept. There like might be a small area of a parking lot that is never occupied ever, but it's only occupied when, for instance, a nuclear reactor is undergoing a fuel loading event. And fuel loading events have to do a lot with, if you take the fuel out of the reactor too early, you have weapons grade material. Whereas if you leave it in for the amount of time that's supposed to be in, it's going to be, it's inert, right? So there obviously a lot of people are interested in monitoring nuclear reactors. And I don't have the time to look at 6 images a day over a nuclear reactor. But if you delimit the geographical boundary where I know that something that has to do with fuel reloading is going to happen. Cars need to park there, people need to go in there, equipment needs to go in there. I don't want to look at the image. I want you to email me when there's a spike in activity at this very specific delimited geographic boundary. And you can also do that over ceasefire zones or over airports or over certain runways. So that sort of delimiting of a geographic boundary and then show a pixel level spike in activity rather than trying to identify and understand the thing. That's also kind of crude sort of automated analysis. But one thing APL, Applied Physics Lab, talked to me about, and I think this is a little above my pay grade, but they are talking about, what is this, unsupervised imagery analysis, unsupervised learning and imagery analysis. I don't get this yet, but this is where I don't tell the algorithm to look for the parking lot that's full at the reactor, or the water effluent that's coming from the reactor, or the smoke that's coming out of the turbine generator room, steam rather. I will give the machine 800 incidents of an active nuclear reactor, and the algorithm or the machine comes up with new visual signatures that I haven't thought of before. So I think that's a cool concept, but go ahead.
So you mean you're giving the machine, say, 800 images, and it is telling you what is consistently the same and what is different. And so basically it does the pattern recognition and anomaly detection for you on those images.
Yeah, and it tells me what the anomaly is. And the anomaly could be something that I've never thought to look for. And I want that. I've never, I get new visual signatures. It's hard to find visual signatures. Boko Haram, it took me 6 weeks to even know what the hell to look for. So I had to go back in the same images and look for the things once I had my clues ready. And when it comes to like looking for a nuclear reactor or looking at a uranium conversion facility, I kind of know what to look for, but I'm not sure. What if there's like a, I don't know, side door that's always open when it's doing this or something? I want a machine to tell me that, and then I want the machine to find it. So I know that that's in the works. I honestly, I'm sure somewhere they're doing it. I just haven't seen it. I just have never really seen that happen in the open source community. Maybe I should read more.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, as a concept, because I think everywhere where we're dealing with big complex data sets, it's all about how do we get the data to sort of, or how do we automate the sort of deconstruction of the data to give us those insights that we wouldn't have seen ourselves if we had plowed through it manually, even if it is even possible to plow through it manually, because some of this, these data sets can be so huge. And I think if we can, well, it feels like we're steadily getting towards that point where we can take some of those other types of data sets. So it could be, for instance, I don't know, event type data, so social media, etc., from a conflict zone where you're seeing again the patterns and trends and then the anomalies, and maybe that gives you something to automate tipping and queuing the images that you want to then collect to, and then automate going through that. And so as an analyst, when you're at the end of that process of these multiple sort of automations connected together, it has a force multiplying effect, I guess. You're able to do a lot more than you would have been able to do on your own, and see things, like you said, that you may not even have thought to look for.
Yeah, that's the dream. That's the dream, Terry.
Well, thinking of dreams, I want to bring you back to that point you made about the sort of crossover from a smart person to a genius. And hope you don't mind, I was going to point people towards an article you wrote a couple of years ago on and published on Medium about how to change the world, which I loved.
Thank you.
I absolutely loved. I love that concept.
So you're the one person that read it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, no, because I really liked that idea of, if you're working in intelligence, if you're working in open source intelligence, and you're dealing with all of this information that's out there, that you can start from that premise of, okay, how can I make a positive change in the world? How can I analyze a situation in a way that I'm looking for something and I'm able to describe and explain something to somebody that is going to have a really positive effect. And so, I really liked that. And I'd recommend it to people who are getting into the imagery analysis field and looking for pointers on where to start maybe, and things to think about, a process to work through as well, which is what I guess you described in the article.
Well, I have to say thank you so much for saying that. That really actually makes my day. So the title, How to Change the World from Space, it's my cynical view of essentially a phenomenon that was occurring about 10, 15 years ago, where a lot of folks in the Silicon Valley were interested in starting new satellite companies. And they didn't necessarily have a product, but they had a dream. And their dream was that they were going to change the world from space. And I'm actually waving my hands while I'm saying this. They were going to change the world from space. So unfortunately, I'm so grateful that you interpreted it the way that you did. And I believe in every word of that article. And I do believe that we can change the world from space. But there was a tiny little drop of cynicism, because if you could say those magic words, you could get a lot of venture capital funding in about 2011, right? So it was a little bit of a slight shade to all the people who, had a dream of just launching a satellite, but ended up not really knowing what to do with the satellite. And in fact, as I think Ashley Vance, he just wrote an incredible book called All the Heavens Are for Sale. And he kind of picks apart the satellite industry just a little bit, a lot of folks wanted satellite companies, but there was a very long lag, and there's a little bit of a delta between building a satellite, launching a satellite, and then once the satellite is there, there's really not a product that is associated with that satellite. And you almost see what I sometimes cynically think are kind of, in California, we have a lot of vanity vineyards. People in the finance and tech industry quit and they grow grapes, right? It's really cool and they make wine. You almost see a couple of vanity satellites where people are launching satellites because Jeff Bezos has got this rocket, I got to have this satellite. So I'm cynical of the entire view. I'm probably screwing myself for saying this.
But I think their phraseology worked. I mean, in terms, I was sold on it. I mean,
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Bless your heart. I'm just kidding.
But no, I think maybe we are at that point though, where there are enough sensors up there now and there's enough information being produced that we can do more positive things than maybe even those people who were just putting stuff up in space for, like you say, vanity reasons, or because they were trying to seek investment for schemes that may or may not have worked. But
Yeah. That actually really
now.
resonates with me. That's actually that dispels what you just said. Really dispels a lot of cynicism that I've carried with me my whole life. So I really I'm that's really interesting, Terry. And you're right. Honestly, coming back to this thing where I don't think there would be a GIS field, a geospatial field. And honestly, these environmental satellites found things like the ozone hole or significant climate change, right? So what are we going to find in 20 years now that imagery isn't $3,000 for a 5 by 5 square kilometer image, right? We're looking at $120 a shot. This is not something that maybe everybody can afford, but this is what you're saying is talking about the democratization of information, right? And if it's cheaper to have satellite imagery, then universities can start. There's a lot of talk where a lot of the people who are doing this are frankly UK or American, but we're starting to see more and more organizations from around the world kind of get into this, and the barriers to entry are diminishing significantly. So the same guys that I am cynical toward for launching satellites without having a very, very clear vision of the project are probably the people who might help usher in a really cool era where you're looking at the world in a more transparent way from space.
That's a lovely sort of note to wrap up on, and I think I've got maybe just time before we end to throw in one more 90s movie reference and ask you, are we finally getting closer to the capabilities we saw in Enemy of the State?
No,
because that was even 10 years before you. I mean, you mentioned 2008. I think that was even 10 years before that. So
I think that was the Will Smith, wasn't that Will Smith?
Yeah.
So every time, so the problem with Enemy of the State is in every presentation I've given, whether it was at Jane's or subsequent, people would say, well, why isn't there live video feed from space? It's also like on CSI. And I swear to God, if you like everybody, so imagery just shows you what it shows you. You cannot zoom in and you just get a clear picture of Will Smith's face. And I've had to live with that question since the first time I've ever presented in the open source community. There's this whole thing where you can just say the word enhance, and instead of seeing a blur, you could see everything clearly. And so I'm not going to get into the orbital science or lens applications and the perfection of a satellite lens or whatever. The payload size has something to do with how much you can see. But to your point, Terry, to answer your question directly, whereas I would have thought we would never get Enemy of the State, I have worked for a company in Arizona that does stratolytes, kind of like that Chinese balloon that was shot over Minnesota that remained undetected. Those stratolytes, they're not regulated by airspace because they're above international airspace, and they're not regulated by space. And you can control them, and they can hold a payload that can get like 5 centimeter resolution video. So I'm not saying it's happened yet, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. That, for instance, I don't know what's where you're in the UK, but if somebody wanted to park a balloon over Terry's hometown, it could stay on station for the reported time is 6 months, and it has enough payload to see video, like to just collect and downlink video, very high resolution, like you could see your face and you could recognize you. And it also has enough capability to hold and carry SAR, which is nighttime vision, radar, sees through clouds, so you can always have that, and then thermal imagery. So you can have 3 different payloads on the same stratolite, as they call it. So yeah, Enemy of the State. Yeah, I mean, if somebody had enough money right now, they could probably rig up a couple of sensors on a worldview balloon, put it anywhere they want, and just spy away, just like CCTV, only in the stratosphere.
And the stratolites are so high that people on the ground aren't going to be able to see them, right?
So I've heard, because Google has Project Loon, where I don't know if they still have that, but they have balloons that does just wireless communications or wireless networking. And so I heard in the morning light, you can get a glint of it. It looks like a star. And I think there were those stratolites in Mountain View, California. I've seen a couple, at least I think I have. Either that, it's like an unidentified flying object, but I'm pretty sure I've seen a few. So it's visible. And once you see it, obviously you would have a country, would have the similar reaction that, for instance, the United States did to the Chinese balloon, but not before it could park there for a good couple of months, maybe undetected. So you never know.
That's incredible. I think that gives us an instant solution to that problem of how do we get aerial or satellite imagery that allows us to continually see where Will Smith is. He's got to get his own vanity Stratolite. If he does that, and we can just watch him 24/7, then problem solved. We've got enemy of the state.
Your lips to Will Smith's ears. I think Chris Rock should buy that Stratolite just to monitor. Well, thank you. I had to make the very topical joke, but
there we go.
I think it's a great idea.
We're straying into controversy, but that's an interesting note to end on.
Well, this was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Terry. This is great.
Allison, thank you so much. And I feel like we could, I know we could talk on this and related topics all day long, and we haven't even got into setting the world straight in terms of how intelligence needs to change and some of the organizations that we would like to see evolve maybe need to, which I know you and I have discussed a lot in the past. But this has been a great run through of, I think, where we're at right now in terms of the state of the art in satellite imagery analysis and the other technologies and the other types of information that feed into that and come together. So that it's been great to get your perspective and from everything you've seen over the years, and you've seen everything. And so it's great. And I'm sure our audience will appreciate that.
Well, I feel so honored. Thank you so much, Terry. Appreciate being here. And call anytime. This was really fun.
Thanks, Allison.
Yeah. Have a good one. Thank you.
I feel there's so much we can learn from Allison's experience and expertise in the art of analysing imagery, and her understanding of how the technology and the industry is evolving, not least how AI is having an impact. And despite the advances being made in areas such as object recognition, for me, I'm struck by Allison's comment about the glut of available imagery and how that's going unanalysed because of the lack of human analyst capability. In addition, the amount of open source intelligence effort that's needed to interpret images and corroborate what they show was a really valuable insight into this area. I'm also very interested to see how regulators deal with future developments, with new technology meaning better imagery and video, which is creating some challenges in terms of privacy and regulation of this competitive sector. On that note, I'm heading off to see if I can park a Stratolite over Will Smith's house. Sensing the Signal is brought to you by Atreides, the behavioural analytics company. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find out more about what we do at atreides.io.